History is not a perfect record. It is a collection of fragments, of stories told and retold, of truths that have been polished or buried by the passage of time. Most often, the stories that are lost are the quiet ones, the tales of small towns, and the private lives of those who lived and died without fanfare. But sometimes, a story is not lost. It is deliberately forgotten. It is hidden away, its edges torn from the official record, because the truth it contains is too sharp, too unsettling to be held.
Where are you all watching this video from? Let me know in the comments so I can see how far my video is reaching and who's watching it. Don't forget to drop your location below.
Today, we journey back to one such story, to a place that has all but vanished from modern maps, and to a man whose name is now only a whisper in the dusty archives of New England. The place was Ashford. The year was 1803, and the man was Elias Thorne in the spring of 1803. Ashford was a testament to the American spirit, carved from the unforgiving wilderness of western Massachusetts. It was a community of about 200 souls, bound together by faith, hardship, and the promise of a self-determined future. At the heart of this promise was the town's lifeblood, the Ashford Mill, and at the heart of the mill was its master, Elias Thorne. Thorne was not merely a miller. He was an architect of prosperity, the son of a Boston watchmaker. He possessed a mind that saw the world not as it was, but as a series of interlocking systems that could be perfected. He was a man of deep, yet quiet, faith, a believer in a divine order that was reflected in the elegant precision of mathematics and mechanics. His contemporaries described him with a consistent reverence. According to Reverend Michael Clark, Ashford's spiritual guide, Mr. Thorne possesses a clarity of thought that is both a comfort and a marvel. To see him work is to witness providence, made manifest in timber and stone. He speaks of gears and water flow with the same passion a preacher speaks of Scripture. This captures the essence of how Elias Thorne was perceived, a pillar of the community, a man whose reason was so profound. It felt like an extension of the divine will. His mill was the most efficient in the county. His ledgers were perfectly balanced, and his counsel was sought on everything from crop rotation to the proper construction of a new church steeple. He was, by all accounts, a man in complete control of his world. But control is a fragile thing, and the world is often far older and stranger than our understanding of it. The story of the change begins, as many strange tales do, with the earth itself. In late May of 1803, after a week of unseasonable, torrential rains, a section of the riverbank beside the mill collapsed, revealing a portion of the foundation that had not seen sunlight since its construction. Elias, ever the perfectionist, closed the mill for 2 days to inspect the damage and ensure the structure's integrity. He worked alone. This was his habit. He trusted his own eyes and his own hands above all others. What he found there in the damp, newly exposed earth beneath his great machine was never recorded in any official log. Our only account of it comes from the private diary of his wife, Elias Thorne. Her entries, written in a tight, worried script, are the first threads of this unsettling tapestry. She wrote on May 28, 1803, Elias returned from the foundation, near midnight. His boots were caked in a dark, slick mud I did not recognize from our soil, and he carried with him a stone. It was not large, no bigger than a loaf of bread, but he held it as if it were a holy relic. When I asked what he had found, he did not answer at first. He simply stood by the fire, turning the thing over and over in his hands. He said only, "The geometry is wrong." I did not know what he meant. He seemed not tired, but energized. There was a look in his eye I had not seen before hunger. The geometry is wrong. A strange phrase. What could it mean? A natural rock formation that defied logic. An artifact left by the indigenous peoples who had lived in the valley for centuries. Elias, a man of science and logic, offered no explanation. He took the stone to his workshop, and for the next week, the sounds from within were not of wood being planed or metal being hammered, but of that strange, incessant scraping. The people of Ashford noticed his absence, but they were not concerned. This was Elias Thorne, after all. His focus was the engine of their prosperity. They trusted him. They could not have known that the man who would eventually emerge from that workshop was no longer the man who had entered it. The change had begun. The whispers beneath the mill had found a willing ear. When Elias Thorne reopened the mill in the first week of June, everything seemed normal. In fact, it seemed better than normal. The great water wheel turned with a new, almost silent efficiency. The grinding stones produced a finer, purer flour than ever before. Production doubled, then tripled. Ashford was suddenly awash in a prosperity that felt miraculous, like a divine blessing. Thorne, when asked about his methods, would simply smile and point to a series of new and complex-looking gear assemblies he had installed. But those who worked closely with him began to notice the small, dissonant details. A young apprentice named Samuel Finch, in a deposition given years later to a traveling magistrate, described the change in his master. He was not the same, Finch stated. He still looked like Mr. Thorne, but the man's weight was different. He moved with a swiftness that was not natural for a man his size. He would adjust a spinning axle with his bare hands, a task that would have torn the flesh from any other man and not even flinch. And his eyes, in the dim light of the mill, sometimes, just for a moment, they seemed to hold a light of their own, a flat, golden light, like a cat's, but with no warmth. This, detailed the glowing eyes, repeated in 2 other private accounts from that summer. It was always fleeting, always dismissed as a trick of the lantern light, a moment of fancy. But the consistency is chilling. More tangible, however, were the drawings. Elias had always been a meticulous draftsman, his plans for the mill known, for their precision. But now, his workshop was littered with new sketches. They were not of gears or levers. They were patterns, intricate, sprawling, geometric designs that seemed to fold in on themselves in impossible ways. They were beautiful, mesmerizing, yet deeply unsettling. They obeyed the laws of perspective and yet simultaneously seemed to defy them. Looking at them for too long, Samuel Finch claimed, would make the head swim and the stomach turn. Reverend Clark, the man who had once praised Elias's mind as a reflection of providence, grew deeply concerned. He saw these drawings not as expressions of mechanical genius, but as something else entirely. He began visiting the Thorne household more frequently, attempting to draw his friend back to the familiar comforts of scripture and prayer. We know of these visits from his diary, a record that transforms from a chronicle of a community's life into a terrifying account of one man's spiritual descent. On June 20th, 1803, the Reverend wrote, "I spoke with Elias for an hour this evening. I read from the book of Job, of God's inscrutable wisdom and power. He listened patiently, a small, knowing smile on his face. When I finished, he unrolled one of his terrible drawings across the table. He said, 'Your God, Michael, built the house.' But he did not lay the foundation. He works with what was already here." He then tapped the drawing. "This," he said, his voice a low hum, "is the blueprint of the foundation. It is older than your Genesis. It is the language of the framework itself." The language of the framework? Elias was no longer just a miller. He had begun to see himself as a prophet of a new, older, and more terrifying kind of order. His work at the mill was no longer about prosperity. It was about reconfiguration. He was, in his own mind, correcting a flaw in the design of the world, using a blueprint he had discovered in the dark earth beneath his feet. His wife, Elspeth, lived in a state of quiet terror. Her diary from this period is a heartbreaking litany of fear and confusion. July 12, 1803, she wrote, "He does not sleep. I have not seen him truly sleep in weeks. He stands at the window for hours, staring out at the mill, even in the dead of night. Sometimes I see the lights on in there, moving in strange, rhythmic patterns. Last night, I awoke to find him standing over our bed. He was not looking at me, but through me. He was whispering, but it was not his voice. It was a chorus of voices, speaking as one, in a language that was all clicks and sharp angles. I pretended to be asleep. I fear I will have to pretend for the rest of my life. The man I married is gone. This new man, he is a guest in my husband's body, a guest in his husband's body." The transformation was no longer just behavioral. It was spiritual, or perhaps something else entirely. Elias Thorne, the rational man, the pillar of Ashford, was becoming a vessel for something ancient and unknowable, and the impossible efficiency of his mill was beginning to look less like a blessing and more like a symptom of a deeply unnatural plague. The townsfolk were growing rich, but a cold, unspoken dread was beginning to settle over the valley like a winter fog. They were profiting from a machine whose master now spoke in the language of impossible angles and answered to a power older than God. By August of 1803, the town of Ashford was living in a paradox. On the one hand, they had never been more prosperous. The Thorne mill was a marvel, its output so prodigious that merchants were now traveling from as far as Albany to trade. On the other hand, the town had become a place of deep and abiding fear. The source of their wealth had become the source of their dread. The transformation of Elias Thorne was now an open, though unspoken, secret. He was rarely seen in town anymore. He seemed to live in the mill, a ghost in his own machine. Those who did catch a glimpse of him reported a man who had been fundamentally altered. He had lost weight, his skin stretched taut over sharp angles, but he moved with a disturbing, fluid grace. He was seen climbing the exterior of the mill with the unnatural coordination of a spider, making adjustments in high, precarious places without a rope or ladder. The phenomena surrounding the mill intensified. The golden light in the windows at night was now a common sight. Travelers on the road after dark spoke of a low, resonant hum that vibrated in their bones as they passed the valley. Some claimed to hear music of strange, discordant harmony that was both beautiful and deeply nauseating. It was described as a choir of voices singing in perfect, mathematical intervals that no human throat could produce. The animals were the first to truly rebel. Dogs would not go near the mill, whining and cowering. Birds were said to fall silent when flying over the property. The river downstream from the mill, once teeming with fish, was now barren. The water itself, according to Samuel Finch, ran colder than ice, even in the height of summer, and had taken on a faint, metallic sheen. It was Reverend Clark who finally decided that action, however perilous, was necessary. He believed he was no longer dealing with a troubled parishioner, but with a case of demonic possession. He saw the mill's unnatural productivity not as engineering, but as a perversion of nature, a blasphemous mockery of God's creation. He rallied a small group of the town's most devout men, not for a violent confrontation, but for an intervention, an exorcism. His journal entry from the night before is the most detailed and terrifying account we have of the prevailing atmosphere in the town. September 5th, 1803. We go tomorrow at dawn. God forgive me if I am wrong, and God strengthen me. If I am right, the fear in this town is a physical thing now. It clings to the walls of the houses. The children do not play in the streets. They draw pictures in the dirt patterns like the ones from Elias's workshop. They hum the terrible tunes they hear on the wind from his cursed mill. I confronted little Martha Gable on this, and she looked at me with her father's eyes and said, "It is only the sound of things fitting into their proper places. Reverend, she is 7 years old. I fear we have waited too long. The influence spreads. It is a contagion of the soul. When I pray now, I feel a resonance, a competing frequency. Something ancient and vast and utterly indifferent is listening, and it is not my Lord. Elias is no longer a man possessed. He is a conductor. He is tuning the town to the frequency of his new, terrible God." The idea of a spiritual contagion is terrifying, that it wasn't just Elias who was changing, but that the very fabric of the community was being retuned, recalibrated to this new, alien order. The confrontation was inevitable, a clash between two faiths, the faith of the cross and the faith of the geometric foundation. On the morning of September 6th, Reverend Clark, accompanied by 5 of the town's selectmen, walked the muddy road to the Ashford mill. They carried Bibles, crosses, and hearts full of a desperate, righteous terror. They intended to save the soul of Elias Thorne. They could not have possibly imagined what they would find waiting for them inside. Elspeth Thorne watched them go from her window. Her final diary entry was written just moments before. September 6th, 1803. The Reverend and the others are going to the mill. A fool's errand. They think they are fighting a demon from their storybooks. They do not understand. You cannot exercise a mathematical equation. You cannot cast out the truth. My Elias is not gone. He has simply expanded. He has become part of a larger design. He tried to show me the beauty in it. The terrible, perfect beauty. I saw it for a moment. I wish to God I had not. Our only account of what happened inside the Ashford mill on September 6 comes from a single source, Thomas Fry, one of the selectmen who accompanied Reverend Clark. Fry did not speak of the event for over 20 years. He lived as a recluse, plagued by nightmares and a debilitating tremor. In 1825, on his deathbed, he gave a frantic, rambling confession to a visiting priest. The priest, disturbed, transcribed the account, and it is only by a miracle of archival preservation that it survives. According to Fry, when they arrived at the mill, they found the great door slightly ajar. The usual thunderous noise of its operation was absent. The silence, he said, was the most frightening sound he had ever heard. With Reverend Clark in the lead, they entered. Elias Thorne was waiting for them in the center of the main floor. He was not raving or threatening. He was calm, serene, even he stood beside the main drive shaft, his hand resting on the cold, silent iron. Reverend Clark began to speak, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He spoke of God's love, of damnation, of the devil's snares. He raised his cross and began the rites of exorcism in Latin. Fry's confession describes what happened next. The Reverend's words, they had no purchase. It was like shouting prayers at a rock. Thorne did not mock him. He just watched, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to a curious, primitive song. When the Reverend finished, Thorne smiled, not a cruel smile, a pitying one. He said, "Your words have power, Michael. They shape belief. They build walls in the mind. But they are only one language, and a very, very new one." Thorne then turned to the men with Clark. He addressed each of them by name. He did not threaten them. He reasoned with them, and his reasoning was the most terrifying part. He spoke of their lives, their secret worries, their small hypocrisies, not as a judgmental God, but as a mechanic diagnosing a faulty machine. He explained how their fears and their prayers were inefficient, disorderly systems. "You pray for rain," he told one man, "but you do not understand the mechanics of the sky. You pray for salvation, but you do not understand the architecture of your own soul." He spoke of existence as a vast, intricate engine. He said that humanity was a gear in that engine that had been poorly designed, grinding against itself, creating friction and noise and pain. He called our free will a chaotic variable in an otherwise perfect system. He said he was not possessed. He said he was repaired. The men were mesmerized, horrified. His words were blasphemy, yet they had a terrible, seductive logic. He was dismantling their reality with calm, rational pronouncements. Reverend Clark, seeing he was losing his men, grew desperate. He lunged forward, shouting the name of Christ, and threw holy water at Thorne. The confession states that the water sizzled on Thorne's skin, but not as if on something damned. It evaporated instantly, like water on a red-hot forge. Thorne did not flinch. He simply looked down at his hand and then back at the Reverend. He said, "You introduce an impurity to the system, an emotional, chaotic element. It creates a reaction. That is not a miracle. It is physics." Then he looked at the Reverend with that terrible, pitying calm. "You believe the universe is a story. It is not. The universe is a diagram, and you are reading it upside down." And then Elias Thorne offered to show them. He told them he would show them the blueprint. He led them away from the main floor, down a set of stairs Fry had never seen before, into the stone foundation of the mill, down into the dark, damp earth where he had found the strange stone. There, in a small, circular chamber, the humming was so intense it was a physical pressure, and in the center of the room was a source. It was not a demon, not a monster. Fry struggled to describe it in the confession, the words failing him. He called it the geometry. It was a pattern of light in the air, a shape that was all shapes. At once, it was alive. It moved and shifted, but it made no sound save for that terrible hum. It was a knot of angles that made my eyes ache and my soul weep. It was a piece of the world's skeleton, and we were not meant to see it. Thorne called it a point of access to the underlying logic. He said it had always been there, sleeping beneath the hill. He had simply woken it up. He had tuned his mill and himself to its frequency. Reverend Clark began to scream. A raw animal sound of a mind breaking. The other men fell to their knees, their faces blank, drool leaking from their mouths. Only Fry, who had hung back at the stairs, was able to look away. Thorne turned to him. The golden light was pouring from his eyes now, from his mouth. When he spoke, it was with the choir of voices. You see, the voices said from Thorne's mouth, it is not about good or evil. It is about alignment, order, harmony. The work must be completed. The system must be optimized. He then gestured to the screaming reverend and the catatonic men. They are discordant notes. They will be retuned or they will be removed. Fry ran. He fled the mill, the town, his life. He never looked back. Thomas Fry's was the last living accountant. After that day, September 6, 1803, Elias Thorne, Reverend Michael Clark, and the 5 selectmen were never seen again. There was no investigation, no search party. The story that the remaining townsfolk agreed upon was a simple one, a necessary fiction to paper over a truth they could not face. The men had argued there had been a fire, a tragic accident. The mill, the source of their unnatural prosperity, was declared unsafe, cursed, and left to rot. Without its engine, the town of Ashford began to wither. The miraculous boom turned to an equally miraculous bust. Families drifted away, seeking simpler, safer lives. The children who had hummed the terrible tunes grew into silent, haunted adults. Within a generation, Ashford was little more than a collection of decaying buildings and forgotten graves. By the time of the Civil War, it had been reclaimed by the wilderness. Wiped from the map. What was the entity, the geometry that Elias Thorne discovered? Was it a demon, as Reverend Clark believed? Was it something extraterrestrial, or was it something far stranger? A fundamental, non-sentient, but powerful component of reality itself, a kind of cosmic operating system that Thorne, through some fluke of intellect and obsession, managed to access. He saw himself not as a victim, but as an upgrade. He achieved an irreversible transformation, becoming a conduit for a terrifying alien order. He didn't want to destroy the world. He wanted to fix it, to tune it to a harmony that had no room for the beautiful, chaotic mess of human emotion, a world without pain, without fear, but also without love, without hope, without choice. A perfect, silent, clockwork universe. The official records are silent. The archives contain only whispers, but stories like this don't truly disappear. They leave echoes. The design that Thorne sketched, that his wife drew in her final days. Similar patterns have reportedly appeared in other places at other times, associated with strange leaps in technological understanding or with communities that simply fall silent. It leaves us with a haunting set of questions. We are a species that constantly strives to understand the universe, to find the underlying patterns, the grand unified theory. But what if we find it? What if the ultimate truth of existence isn't a comforting story or a benevolent God, but a cold, indifferent, and utterly alien piece of mathematics? What if the price of ultimate knowledge is our own humanity? Elias Thorne believed he was bringing order to chaos. He was retuning the system. Perhaps the work is still being done, quietly, in forgotten corners of the world. Perhaps the hum is still out there, waiting for another brilliant, obsessive mind to hear its call and tune in. Have you ever heard a story like this? A local legend of a brilliant mind that simply changed. And if you were offered that choice to understand the deepest workings of reality, but at the cost of everything that makes you who you are, would you have chosen differently?